Introduction to The Man in the Iron Mask. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Man in the Iron Mask by Alexandre Dumas, the Elder, or Hare. Introduction. In the months of March through July in 1844, in the magazine Le Siècle, the first portion of a story appeared, penned by the celebrated playwright Alexandre Dumas. It was based, he claimed, on some manuscripts he had found a year earlier in the Bibliothèque Nationale while researching a history he planned to write on Louis XIV. They chronicled the adventures of a young man named D'Artagnan, who, upon entering Paris, became almost immediately embroiled in court intrigues, international politics, and ill-fated affairs between royal lovers. Over the next 6 years, readers would enjoy the adventures of this youth and his three famous friends, Porthos, Athos, and Aramis, as their exploits unraveled behind the scenes of some of the most momentous events in French and even English history. Eventually, these serialized adventures were published in novel form and became the three D'Artagnan romances known today. Here is a brief summary of the first two novels. The Three Musketeers, serialized March through July 18.
Hey Migs, how you doing, bro?
The year
Thanks
is
for stopping
25.
by. First one here.
D'Artagnan arrives in Paris at the tender age of 18 and almost immediately offends three musketeers, Porthos, Aramis, and Athos. Instead of dueling, the
See
two
what show
are
this
attacked by
today.
5 of the cardinal's guards, and the courage of the youth is made
Limited on what I can listen to for my books, because these ones so far are on the public domain, so I could play these ones. Let's see. Here, Dunwich Horror by Lovecraft, or The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Decisions. Let's go with The Invisible Man.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit www.librivox.org. Today's reading by Alex Foster. www.alexfoster.me.uk. The Invisible Man.
Instead of reading a book and smoking, might as well have someone else read it and then smoke.
The stranger came early in February, one wintry day, through a biting wind and a driving snow, the last snowfall of the year. Over the down, walking from Bramblehurst railway station and carrying a little black portmanteau which thickly gloved. He was wrapped up from head to foot, and the brim of his soft felt hat hid every inch of his face but the shiny tip of his nose. The snow had piled itself against his shoulders and chest, and added a white crest to the burden he carried. He staggered into the coach and horses, more dead than alive, and flung his portmanteau down. "A fire!" he cried. "In the name of human charity, a room under fire!" He stamped and shook the snow from off himself in the bar, and followed Mrs. Hall into her guest parlour to strike his bargain. And with that much introduction, that and a couple of sovereigns flung upon the table, he took up his quarters in the inn. Mrs. Hall lit the fire and left it there while she went to preparing a meal with her own hands. A guest to stop piping in the winter-time was an unheard-of piece of luck, let alone a guest who was no haggard, and she resolved to show herself worthy of her good fortune. As soon as the bacon was well under way, Milly, an emphatic aid, had been brisked up a bit by a few deftly chosen expressions of contempt. She carried the cloth, plates, and glasses into the parlour, and began to lay them with the utmost eclat. Although the fire was burning up briskly, she was surprised
clasped behind him, and he seemed to be lost in thought. She noticed that the melting snow that still sprinkled his shoulders dripped upon her carpet. "Can I take your hat and coat, sir?" she said, "and give them a good dry in the kitchen?" "No," he said without turning. She was not sure she had put him, and was about to repeat her question. He turned his head and looked at her over his shoulder. "I prefer to keep them on," he said with emphasis, and she noticed that he wore big blue spectacles with side lights, and had a bush side whisker over his coat collar that completely hid his cheeks and face. "Very well, sir," she said. "As you like. In a bit the room will be warm." He made no answer, and had turned his face away from her again, and Mrs. Hall, feeling that her conversational advances were ill-timed, laid the rest of the table things in a quick staccato and whisked out of the room. When she returned, he was still standing there, like a man of stone, his back hunched, his collar turned up, his dripping hat brim turned down, hiding his face and ears completely. She put down the eggs and bacon with considerable emphasis, and called rather than said to him, "Your lunch is served, sir." "Thank you," he said at the same time, and did not stir until she was closing the door. Then he swung round and approached the table with a certain eagerness. As she went behind the bar to the kitchen, she heard a sound repeated at regular intervals. Chirp, 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 it went, the sound of a spoon being rapidly whisked around a basin. "That girl," she said, "there, you clean forgot that it's her being so long." And while she herself finished mixing the mustard, she gave Milly a few verbal stabs for her excessive slowness. She had cooked the ham and eggs, laid the table, and done everything, while Milly, well, indeed, had only succeeded in delaying the mustard, and him a new guest and wanting to stay. Then she filled the mustard pot, and, putting it with a certain stateliness upon a golden black tea tray, carried it into the parlour. She rapped and entered promptly. As she did so, the visitor moved quickly, so that she got but a glimpse of a white object disappearing behind the table. It would seem he was picking something from the floor. She rapped down the mustard pot on the table. Then she noticed the overcoat and hat had been taken off and put over a chair in front of the fire, and a pair of wet boots threatened rust to her steel fender. She went to these things resolutely. "I suppose I may have them to dry now," she said in a voice that brooked no remark. "Leave the hat," said her visitor in a muffled voice, and turning, she saw he had raised his head and was sitting and looking at her. For a moment she stood gaping, too surprised to speak. He held a white cloth. It was a serviette he had brought with him, over the lower part of his face, so that his mouth and jaws were completely hidden, and that was the reason it was not closed. But it was not that which startled Mrs. Hall. It was the fact that all his forehead above his blue glasses was covered by a white bandage, and that another covered his ears, leaving not a scrap of his face exposed, excepting only his pink, pinked nose. It was bright pink and shiny, just as it had been at first. He wore a dark brown velvet jacket with a high, black, million-lined collar turned up about his neck. The thick black hair, escaping as it could below and between the cross bandages, projected in curious trails and horns, giving him the strangest appearance conceivable. His muffled and bandaged head was so unlike what she had anticipated, that for a moment she was rigid. He did not remove the serviette, but remained holding it, as she saw now, with a brown gloved hand, and regarding her with his inscrutable blue glasses. "Leave the hat," he said, speaking very distinctly through the white cloth. Her nerves began to recover from the shock that they had received. She placed the hat on the chair again by the fire. I didn't know, sir," she began, "but—" and she stopped, embarrassed. "Thank you," he said dryly, glancing from her to the door, then turning back. "I'll have them nicely dried, sir, at once," she said, and carried his clothes out of the room. She glanced at his white swathed head and blue goggles again as she was going out of the door, but his napkin was still in front of his face. She shivered a little as she closed the door behind her, and her face was eloquent of surprise and perplexity. "I never," she whispered. Then she went quite softly to the kitchen, and was too preoccupied to ask Milly what she was messing about with now, she got there. The visitor sat and listened to her retreating feet. He glanced inquiringly at the window before he removed his serviette and resumed his meal. He took a mouthful, glanced suspiciously at the window, took another mouthful, then rose, and, taking the serviette in his hand, walked across the room and pulled the blind down to the top of the white muslin that obscured the lower panes. This left the room in a twilight. This done, he returned with an easier air to the table for his meal. The poor soul's had an accident or an operation or something, said Mrs. Hall. To turn them bandages to give me to be sure. She put on some more coal, unfolded the clothes horse, and the traveller's coat and pockets. And they goggles. Why, he was more like a diving helmet than a human man. She hung his muffler on a corner of the horse, holding that handkerchief over his mouth all the time, talking through it. And his mouth was hurt too, maybe. She turned round as one who suddenly remembers. Bless my soul alive, she said, going off at a tangent. Ain't you done them taters yet, Milly? When Mrs. Hall went to clear away the stranger's lunch, her idea that his mouth must also have been cut or disfigured in the accident she supposed him to have suffered was confirmed, that he was smoking a pipe, and all the time that she was in the room he never loosened the silk muffler he had wrapped around the lower part of his face to put the mouthpiece to his lips. Yet he was not forgetful. She saw he glanced at it as it smouldered out. He sat in the corner with his back to the window blind and spoke now, having eaten and drunk and being comfortably warmed through, with loosey-goosey words like before. The reflection of the fire lent a kind of red animation to his big spectacles that they had lacked hitherto. I have some luggage, he said, at Bramblehurst Station. And he asked her how it could have been sent. He bowed his bandaged head quite politely in acknowledgement of her explanation. Tomorrow, he said, there is no speedier delivery? Anne seemed quite disappointed when she answered no. Was she quite sure? No man with a trap could go over? Mrs. Hall, nothing loath, answered his questions and developed a conversation. It's a steep road by the downs, sir, she said in answer to the question about the trap, and then snatching at an opening said, it was there a carriage was upsaddled a year ago and more. A gentleman killed besides his coachman. Accidents, sir, happen in a moment, don't they? But the visitor was not to be drawn so easily. They do, he said through his muffler, eyeing her quietly through his impenetrable glasses. But they take long enough to get well, don't they? There was my sister's son, Tom, just cut his arm with a scythe, and tumbled on it in the hayfield, and, bless me, he was 3 months tied up there. You hardly believe it, it's regular given the dread of a scythe, sir. I can quite understand that. He was afraid one time that he'd have to have an operation. Was that bad, sir? The visitor laughed abruptly, a bark of a laugh that he seemed to bite and kill in his mouth. Was he? He said. He was, sir, and no laughing matter to them as had for doing for him. As I had, my sister being took up with her little one so much, there was bandages to do, sir, and bandages to undo. So that, if I might be so bold as to say so, will you get me some matches? Said the visitor quite abruptly. My pipe is out. Mrs. Hall was pulled up suddenly. It was certainly rude of him, after telling him all she had done. She gasped at him for a moment, and then remembered the 2 sovereigns, and she went for the matches. Thanks, he said concisely as she put them down, and turned his shoulder upon her and stared out of the window again. It was altogether too discouraging. Evidently he was sensitive on the topic of operations and bandages. She did not make so bold as to say, however, after all. But his snubbing way had irritated her, and Milly had a hot time of it that afternoon. The visitor remained in the parlour until 4 o'clock, without giving the ghost of an excuse for intrusion. For the most part he was quite still during that time, as it would seem he sat in the growing darkness, smoking in the firelight, perhaps dozing. Once or twice a curious listener might have heard him at the coals, and for the space of 5 minutes was audible pacing the room. He seemed to be talking to himself. Then the armchair creaked as he sat down again. Chapter 2. Mr. Teddy Henfrey's First Impressions. A 4 o'clock, when it was fairly dark, Mrs. Hall was screwing up her courage to go in and ask her visitor if he would take some tea. Teddy Henry, the clock jobber, came into the bar. "My sakes, Mr. Hall," said he, "but this is terrible weather for thin boots." The snow outside was falling faster. Mrs. Hall agreed, and then noticed he had his bag with him. "Now you're here, Mr. Teddy," said she, "I'd be glad if you'd give the old clock in the parlour a bit of a look. It is going, and it strikes well and hearty, but the hour hand won't do nothing but point at 6. And, leading the way, she went across to the parlour door, unwrapped, and entered. Her visitor, she saw as she opened the door, was seated in the armchair before the fire, dozing, it would seem, with his bandaged head drooping on one side. The only light in the room was the red glow from the fire, which lit his eyes like adverse railway signals, but left his downcast face in darkness, and the scanty vestiges of the day came in through the open door. Everything was ruddy, shadowy, and indistinct to her, the more so since she had just been lighting the bar lamp, and her eyes were dazzled. But for a second it seemed to her that the man she looked at had an enormous mouth wide open, a vast and incredible mouth that swallowed the whole of the lower portion of his face. It was the sensation of a moment, the white bound head, the monstrous goggle eyes, and this huge yawn below it. Then he stirred, started up in his chair, put up his hand. She opened the door wide so that the room was lighter, and she saw him more clearly with the muffler held up to his face, just as she had seen him hold the serviette before. The shadows, she fancied, had tricked her. "Would you mind, sir, this man coming to look at the clock, sir?" she said, recovering from the momentary shock. "Look at the clock," he said, staring round in a drowsy manner and speaking over his hand, and then, getting more fully awake, "Sir." Mrs. Hall went away to get a lamp, and he rose and stretched himself. Then came the light, and Mr. Teddy Henry, entering, was confronted by this bandaged person. He was, he says, taken aback. "Good afternoon," said the stranger, regarding him, as Mr. Henry says, with a vivid sense of the dark spectacles, like a lobster. "I hope," said Mr. Henry, "that it's no intrusion." "None whatever," said the stranger. "So I understand," he said, turning to Mrs. Hall, "that this room is really to be mine for my own private use." "I thought, sir," said Mrs. Hall, "you'd prefer the clock." "Certainly," said the stranger, "certainly. But as a rule, I like to be alone and undisturbed." "But I'm really glad to have the clock seen to," he said, seeing a certain hesitation in Mr. Henry's manner. "Very glad." Mr. Henry had intended to apologize and withdraw, but this anticipation reassured him. The stranger turned round with his back to the fireplace and put his hands behind his back. "Presently," he said, "when the clock mending is over, I think I should like to have some tea, but not till the clock mending is over." Mrs. Hall was about to leave the room. She made no conversational advances this time, because she did not want to be snubbed in front of Mr. Henry, when her visitor asked her if she had made any arrangements about his boxes of bramble. She told him she had mentioned the matter to the postman, and that the carrier could bring them over on the morrow. "You are certain that that is the earliest?" he said. She was certain, with a marked coldness. "I should explain," he added, "what I was really too cold and fatigued to do before, that I am an experimental investigator." "Indeed, sir," said Mrs. Hall, much impressed. "And my baggage contains apparatus and appliances." "Very useful things indeed they are, sir," said Mrs. Hall. "And I'm very naturally anxious to get on with my inquiries." "Oh, of course, sir." "My reason for coming to Iping," he proceeded with a certain deliberation of manner, "was a desire for solitude. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. In addition to my work, an accident—" "I thought as much," said Mrs. Hall to herself. "An accident necessitates a certain retirement. My eyes are sometimes so weak and painful that I have shut myself up in the dark for hours together. Lock myself up, sometimes, now and then. Not at present, certainly. But at such times, the slightest disturbance, the entry of a stranger into the room, is a source of excruciating annoyance to me. It is well these things should be understood." "Certainly, sir," said Mrs. Hall. And if I may make so bold as to ask, that I think is all, said the stranger, with that quietly irresistible air of finality he could assume at will. Mrs. Hall reserved her question and sympathy for a better occasion. After Mrs. Hall had left the room, he remained standing in front of the fire, glaring, so Mr. Henfrey puts it, at the clock window. Mr. Henfrey not only took off the hands of the clock and the face, but extracted the works, and he tried to work in as slow and quiet and unassuming manner as possible. He worked with the lamp close to him, and the green shade threw a brilliant light upon his hands and upon the brown walls, and left the rest of the room showy. When he looked up, coloured patches swam in his eyes. Being constitutionally of a curious nature, he had removed the works, a quite unnecessary proceeding, with the idea of delaying his departure, and perhaps falling into conversation with the stranger. But the stranger stood there, perfectly silent and still. So still, it got on Henfrey's nerves. He felt alone in the room and looked up, and there, grey and dim, was the bandaged head and huge blue lenses, staring fixedly with a mist of green spots drifting in front of him. It was so uncanny to Henfrey that for a minute they remained staring blankly at one another. Then Henfrey looked down again. Very uncomfortable position. One would like to say something. Should he remark that the weather was very cold and terribly wet? He looked up as if to take aim with that introductory shot. The weather, he began. Why don't you finish and go? Said the rigid figure, evidently in a state of painfully suppressed rage. All you've got to do is fix the hour hand on its axle. You're simply humbugging. Certainly, sir. 1 minute more, I overlooked, and Mr. Henfrey finished and went. But he was feeling excessively annoyed. Damn it, said Mr. Henfrey to himself, trudging down the village through the pouring snow. A man must do a clock at times, surely. And again, can't a man look at you? Ugly. And yet again, seemingly not. If the police were wanting you, you wouldn't be more wrapped and bandaged. At Gleason's corner, he saw Hall, who had recently married the stranger's hostess of the coach and horses, and who now drove the piping conveyance, when occasional people required it, to Sidderbridge Junction, coming towards him on his return from that place. Hall had evidently been stopping a bit at Sidderbridge, to judge by his driving. How do, Teddy? He said, passing. You've got a rum enough at home, said Teddy. Hall very socially pulled up. What's that? He said. Rum-looking customer stopping at the coach and horses, said Teddy. My sakes. And he proceeded to give Hall a vivid description of his grotesque guest. Looks a bit like a disguise, don't it? I'd like to see a man's face if I had him stopping at my place, said Henfrey. But women are that trustful when strangers are concerned. He's took your rooms and he hadn't even given a name, Hall. You don't say so, said Hall, who was a man of sluggish apprehension. Yes, said Teddy, by the week. Wherever he is, you can't get rid of him under the week. And he's got a lot of luggage coming tomorrow, so he says. Let's hope it won't be stones in boxes. He told Hall how his aunt at Hastings had been swindled by a stranger with empty portmanteau. Altogether, he left Hall vaguely suspicious. Get up, old girl, said Hall. I suppose I must see about this. Teddy trudged on his way with his mind considerably relieved. Instead of seeing about it, however, Hall on his return was severely rated by his wife on the length of time he had spent in Sidderbridge, and his mild inquiries were answered snappishly and in a manner not to the point. But the seed of suspicion Teddy had sowed germinated in the mind of Mr. Hall, in spite of these discouragements. You women don't know anything, said Mr. Hall, resolved to ascertain more about the personality of his guest at the earliest possible opportunity. And after the stranger had gone to bed, which he did about 9:30, Mr. Hall went very aggressively into the parlour and looked very hard at his wife's furniture, just to show that the stranger wasn't master there, and scrutinised closely and a little contemptuously a sheet of mathematical computations the stranger had left. When retiring for the night, he instructed Mrs. Hall to look very closely at the stranger's luggage when he came the next day. You mind your own business, Hall, said Mrs. Hall, and I'll mind mine. She was all the more inclined to snap at Hall, because the stranger was undoubtedly an unusually strange sort of stranger, and she was by no means assured about him her own money. In the middle of the night, she woke up dreaming of huge white heads like turnips that came trailing after her at the end of interminable nails and with vast black eyes. But, being a sensible woman, she subdued her terrors and turned over and went to sleep again. End of chapter 2. Recorded by Alex Foster. www.alexfoster.me.uk in Nottingham, England, on the 13th of March 2006. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit www.librivox.org. Today's reading by Alex Foster. www.alexfoster.me.uk. The Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. Chapter 3. The 1001 Bottles. So it was that on the 29th day of February, at the beginning of the thaw, this singular person fell out of infinity into Flickering Village. Next day, luggage arrived through the slush. Very remarkable luggage it was. There were a couple of trunks indeed, such as a rational man might need. But in addition, there were a box of books, big, fat books of which some were just in incomprehensible handwriting, and a dozen or more crates, boxes and cases, containing objects packed in straw, as it seemed to Paul, tugging with a casual curiosity at the straw, glass bottles. The stranger, muffled in hat, coat, gloves, and wrapper, came out impatiently to meet Clearenside's cart. Paul, who was having a word or so of gossip, prepared to help him within. Out he came, not noticing Clearenside's dog, who was sniffing in a dilettante spirit at Paul's legs. "Come along with those boxes," he said. "I've been waiting long enough." And he came down the steps towards the tail of the car, as if to lay hands on the smaller crate. No sooner had Clearenside's dog caught sight of him, however, than he began to bristle and growl savagely, and when he rushed down the steps, it gave an undecided hop and then sprang straight at his hand. "Ugh!" cried Hall, jumping back. But he was no hero with dogs, and Clearenside howled, "Lie down!" and snatched his whip. They saw the dog's teeth had slipped the hand, heard a kick, saw the dog execute a flanking jump and get home on the stranger's leg, and heard the rip of his trouser. Then the finer end of Clearenside's whip reached his property, and the dog, yelping with dismay, retreated under the wheels of the wagon. It was all the business of a swift half-minute. No one spoke. Everyone shouted. The stranger glanced swiftly at his torn glove and at his leg, made as if he would stoop to the latter, then turned and rushed swiftly up the steps into the inn. They heard him go headlong across the passage and up the uncarpeted steps to his bedroom. "You brute, you," said Clearenside, climbing off the wagon with his whip in his hand while the dog watched him through the wheel. "Come here," said Clearenside. "You'd better." Hall had stood gaping. "He was bit," said Hall. "I'd better go to see to him." And he trotted after the stranger. He met Mrs. Hall in the passage. Carried a dog.
Hey, Panda Cat, how you doing?
He went straight
Thanks for
upstairs,
stopping by.
checked his door being ajar, pushed it open, and was entering without any ceremony, being of a naturally sympathetic turn of mind. The blind was down and the room dim. He caught a glimpse of a most
Yeah, I'm at a
what seemed
smoke
to
right now, so I'm just resin hitting my pipe right now.
three huge indeterminate spots on white, very like the face of a pale pansy. Then he was was struck violently in the chest, held back, and the door slammed in his face and locked. It was so rapid that it gave him no time to observe. A waving of indecipherable shapes, a blow, and a concussion. Then he stood on the dark little landing, wondering what it might have been that he had seen. A couple of minutes later, he rejoined the little group that had formed outside the coach and horses. There was fear inside, telling about it all over again. There was Mrs. Cole saying his dog didn't have no business to bite her guests. The general dealer from over the road, interrogative, and Sandy Wedges, forge, judicial, besides women and children.
Yeah, it's not going too bad, Panda Cat.
I wouldn't let him bite even me, I know. It isn't right to have such dogs. What are you biting for then? Mrs. Hall, staring at them from the steps and listening, found it incredible that he had seen anything so very remarkable in another's face. Besides, his vocabulary was altogether too limited to express his passion. You don't want no help, he said in answer to his wife's inquiry.
Hope all well's with you too, Panda Cat. Said resident hitting my ball. I forgot I had this.
What I do, said the lady in the room. Suddenly, the dog began growling again. Come along, cried an angry voice at the doorway.
There we go. A nice Carter, some blueberry.
The sooner you get those things in, the better.
Can't remember if Blueberry OG or Blueberry Kush.
It is stated by an anonymous bystander that his trousers and gloves have been changed. Was you hurt, sir? Said Fieldside. I'm rare sorry the dog. Not a bit, said the stranger. Never broke the skin. Hurry up with those things. He then swore to himself, said Mr. Hall says. Directly the first crate was in accordance with his directions, carried into the parlor, the stranger flung it.
Definitely helps when you, and for example, now,
scattering the straw with an utter disregard
out of smoke, so this next best thing.
Little fat bottles containing powders, small and slender bottles containing coloured white fluids, fluted blue bottles labelled poison, bottles with round bodies and slender necks, large green glass bottles, large white glass bottles, bottles with glass stoppers and frosted labels, bottles with fine corks, bottles with bones, bottles with wooden caps, wine bottles, salad oil bottles. Putting them in rows on the chiffonier, on the mantel, on the table under the window, round the floor, on the bookshelf, everywhere. The chemist's shop in Bramblehurst could not boast half so many. Quite a sight it was. Crate after crate yielded bottles until all 6 were empty, and the table high with straw. The only things that came out of these crates beside the bottles were a number of test tubes and a carefully packed bags. And directly the crates were unpacked, the stranger went to the window and set to work, not troubling in the least about the litter of straw, the fire which had gone out, the box of books outside, nor for the trunks and other luggage that had gone upstairs. When Mrs. Hall took his dinner to him, he was already so absorbed in the pouring little drops out of the that he did not hear her until she had swapped the straw seeing the state that her floor was in. He turned his head and immediately turned it away. But she saw he had removed his glasses. They were beside him on the table, and it seemed to her that his eye sockets were extraordinarily hollow. He put on his spectacles again and then turned and faced her.
Alright, what are you going to be packing a bowl of?
Floor when he anticipated her. I wish you
Panda Cat.
without knocking, he said in a tone of abnormal exasperation that seemed so characteristic of him. I knocked, but seemingly, perhaps you did. But in my investigations, my really very urgent and necessary investigations, the slightest disturbance, the jar of a door, I must ask you. Certainly, sir. You could turn the lock if you're like that, you know. Any time. A very good idea, said the stranger. This straw, sir, if I can be so bold as to remark. Don't. If the straw makes trouble, put it down in the bin. And he mumbled at her, words suspiciously like curses. It was so odd, standing there, so aggressive and explosive, bottle in one hand and test tube in the other, that Mrs. Hall was quite alarmed. But she was a resolute woman. In which case, I should like to know, sir, what you consider a shilling. Put down a shilling. Surely a shilling for that. Save it, said Mrs. Hall, taking out the tablecloth and beginning to spread it over the table. If you're satisfied, of course. He turned and sat down with his coat collar toward her. All the afternoon he worked with the door locked, and, as Mrs. Hall testifies, for the most part, silent. But once there was a concussion and the sound of bottles ringing together, as though the table had been hit, and the smash of a bottle had flung violently down, and then a rapid pacing athwart the room. Fearing something was the matter, she went to the door and listened, not caring to move. I can't go on, he was raving. I can't go on. 300,000, 400,000, the huge multitude, cheated. All my life it may take me. Patience, patience indeed. Fool, fool. There was a noise of hobnails on the bricks in the bar, and Mrs. Hall had very reluctantly released the rest of his saloon. When she returned, the room was silent again, save for the faint crepitation of his chair and the occasional clink of a bottle. With all over, the stranger had resumed his work. When she took in his tea, she saw broken glass in the corner of the room under the concave mirror, and a golden stain that had been carelessly wiped. She called attention to it. Put it down in the bill, snapped her visitor. For God's sake, don't worry me. If there's damage done, put it down in the bill. And he went on ticking a list in the exercise book before him. I'll tell you something, said Fearenside mysteriously. It was late in the afternoon, and they were in a little beer shop at Rhinelander. Well, said Teddy Humphrey. This chap you're speaking of, what my dog bit, well, he's black. Leastways his legs are. I see through the tear of his trousers and the tear of his glove. You'd have expected a sort of pinky to show, wouldn't you? Well, there wasn't none. Just blackness. I tell you, he's as black as night. I said, Senator, it's a rummy case altogether. Why, his nose is as pink as paint. That's true, said Fearenside. I know he knows that, and I tell you what I'm thinking.
Treasure Island. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Read by Adrian Praetzelis. Chapter 3. Black Spot. About noon, I stopped at the captain's door with some cooling drinks and medicines. He was lying very much as we had left him, only a little higher, and he seemed both weak and excited. Jim, he said, you're the only one here that's worth anything, and you know I've always been good to you. Never a month but I've given you a silver fourpenny for yourself, and now you see, mate, I'm pretty low and deserted by him. And Jim, you'll bring me one noggin of rum now, won't you, matey? The doctor, I began, but he broke in, cursing the doctor in a feeble voice, but heartily. Doctors is all swabs, he said. And that doctor there, why, what does he know about seafaring men? I've been in places hot as pitch, and mates dropping round with yellow jack, and the blessed land a-heaving like the sea with earthquakes. What do the doctor know of lands like that? And I've lived on rum, I can tell you. It's been meat and drink, man and wife to me, and if I'm not to have the horrors. I've seen some of them already. I've seen old Flint in the corner there behind you, plain as print. I've seen him. You forget the horrors. That has lived rough and raised Cain. The old doctor himself said one glass wouldn't hurt me. I'll give you a golden guinea for a noggin, Jim. He was growing more and more excited, and this alarmed me for my father, who was very low that day, needing quiet. Besides, I was reassured by the doctor's words, now quoted to me, and rather offended by the offer of a bribe. I want none of your money, said I, but what you owe my father. I'll get you one glass and no more. When I brought it to him, he seized it greedily and drank it out. Aye, said he, that's some better sure enough. And now, matey, did that doctor say how long I was to lie here in this old berth? A week at least, said I. Thunder, he cried, a week? I can't do that. They'd have the black spot on me by then. The lubbers is going to get the wind of me this blessed moment. Lubbers as couldn't keep what they got and want to nail boys and others. Is that seemingly behaving now, I want to know? But I'm a saving soul. I never wasted good money of mine, nor lost it neither. An old trick of the game. I'm not afraid of them. I'll shake out another reef, matey, and dandle them again. As he was thus speaking, he had risen from bed with great
Nynaeve said. She is in Camelin, and we will be in Tarvalon. No, we may be in enough trouble already for going off as we did, no matter what we've brought back. It will be best if we stay low, behave humbly, and do nothing to attract more attention than we already have. Another time, Egwene would have laughed at the idea of Nynaeve pretending to be humble. Even Elaine managed a better job of it, but at present she did not feel like laughing. And if Huron is right, if we are attacked, he cannot defend us against 20 or 30 men, and we might be dead if we wait for Verin to do something. You said you sense a storm, Nynaeve. You do? Elaine said. Red gold curls swung as she shook her head. Verin will not like it if we... She trailed off. Whatever Verin likes or doesn't like, we may have to. I will do what must be done, Nynaeve said sharply. If there is anything to be done, and you two will run if need be. The White Tower may be all abuzz with your potential, but don't think they will not still you both if the Amerlin seat or the hall of the tower decides it is necessary. Elaine swallowed hard. If they would still us for it, she said in a faint voice, they would still you too. We should all run together, or act together. Huron has been right before. If we want to live to be in trouble in the tower, we may have to. We do what we must.
Give me 1 second, everyone.
Still, cut off from Saidar, the female half of the true source. Few Aes Sedai had ever incurred that penalty, yet there were deeds for which the tower demanded stilling. Novices were required to learn the names of every Aes Sedai who had ever been stilled, and their crimes. She could always feel the source there, now, just out of sight, like the sun at noon over her shoulder. If she often caught nothing when she tried to touch Saidar, she still wanted to touch it. The more she touched it, the more she wanted to, all the time, no matter what Shiriam Sedai, the mistress of novices, said about the dangers of growing too fond of the feel of the one power. To be cut off from it, still able to sense Saidar, but never to touch it again. Neither of the others seemed to want to talk either. To cover her shaking, she bent from her saddle to the gently swaying litter. Mat's blankets had become disarrayed, exposing a curved dagger in a golden sheath clutched in one hand, a ruby the size of a pigeon's egg capping the hilt. Careful not to touch the dagger, she eased the blankets back over his hand. He was only a few years older than she, but gaunt cheeks and sallow skin had aged him. His chest barely moved as he breathed hoarsely. A lumpy leather sack lay at his feet. She shifted the blanket to cover that, too. We have to get Mat to the tower, she thought. And the sack. Nynaeve leaned down as well and felt Mat's forehead. His fever is worse, she sounded worried. If only I had some worry-knot root or fever-bane. Perhaps if Varen tried healing again, Elaine said. Nynaeve shook her head. She smoothed Matt's hair back and sighed, then straightened before speaking. She says it is all she can do to keep him alive now, and I believe her. I tried healing last night myself, but nothing happened. Elaine gasped. Shiriam Sedai says we mustn't try to heal until we've been guided step by step 100 times. You could have killed him, Egwene said sharply. Nynaeve sniffed loudly. I was healing before I ever thought of going to Tar Valon, even if I didn't know I was. But it seems I need my medicines to make it work for me. If I only had some fever pain, I do not think he has much time left. Hours, maybe. Egwene thought she sounded almost as unhappy about knowing, about how she knew, as she did about Matt. She wondered again why Nynaeve had chosen to go to Tar Valon for training at all. She had learned to channel unknowingly, even if she could not always control the act, and had passed the crisis that killed 3 out of 4 women who learned without Aes Sedai guidance. Nynaeve said she wanted to learn more, but often she was as reluctant about it as a child being dosed with sheep's tongue root. We will have him in the White Tower soon, Egwene said. They can heal him there. The Amyrlin will take care of him. She will take care of everything. She did not look at where Matt's blanket covered the sack at his feet. The other 2 women were studiously not looking at it either. There were some secrets they would all be relieved to shed. Riders, Nynaeve said suddenly, but Egwene had already seen them. 24 men appearing over a low rise ahead, white cloaks flapping as they galloped, angling toward them. Children of the light, Elaine said like a curse. I think we have found your storm, and Huron's trouble. Varen had pulled up, a hand on Huron's arm to stop him drawing his sword. Egwene touched the lead litter horse to stop it just behind the plump Aes Sedai. Let me do all the talking, children, the Aes Sedai said placidly, pushing her cowl back to reveal gray in her hair. Egwene was not sure how old Varen was. She thought old enough to be a grandmother, but the gray streaks were the Aes Sedai's only signs of age. And whatever you do, do not allow them to make you angry. Varen's face was as calm as her voice, but Egwene thought she saw the Aes Sedai measuring the distance to Tar Valon. The tops of the towers were visible now, and a high bridge arching over the river to the island, tall enough for the trading ships that plied the river to sail beneath. Close enough to see, Egwene thought, but too far to do any good. For a moment she was sure the oncoming white cloaks meant to charge them, but their leader raised a hand, and they abruptly drew rein a scant 40 paces off, scattering dust and dirt ahead of them. Nynaeve muttered angrily under her breath, and Elaine sat straight and full of pride, appearing likely to berate the white cloaks for ill manners. Huron still had a grip on his sword hilt. He looked ready to put himself between the women and the white cloaks, no matter what Varen said. Varen mildly waved a hand in front of her face to dispel the dust. The white-cloaked riders spread out in an arc, blocking the way firmly. Their breastplates and conical helmets shone from polishing, and even the mail on their arms gleamed brightly. Each man had the flaring golden sun on his breast. Some fitted arrows to bows, which they did not raise but held ready. Their leader was a young man, yet he wore 2 golden knots of rank beneath the sunburst on his cloak. 2 Tar Valon witches, unless I miss my guess, yes? He said with a tight smile that pinched his narrow face. Arrogance brightened his eyes, as if he knew some truth others were too stupid to see. And 2 nits and a pair of lapdogs, one sick and one old. Huron bristled, but Varen's hand restrained him. Where do you come from? The white cloak demanded. We come from the west, Varen said placidly. Move out of our way and let us continue. The children of the light have no authority here. The children have authority wherever the light is, witch, and where the light is not, we bring it. Answer my questions. Or must I take you to our camp and let the questioners ask? Matt could not afford any more delay in reaching help in the White Tower. And more importantly, Egwene winced to think of it that boy. More importantly, they could not let the contents of that sack fall into Whitecloak hands. I have answered you, Varen said, still calm, and more politely than you deserve. Do you really believe you can stop us? Some of the White Cloaks raised their bows as if she had uttered a threat, but she went on, her voice never rising. In some lands you may hold sway by your threats, but not here inside of Tar Valon. Can you truly believe that in this place you will be allowed to carry off Aes Sedai? The officer shifted uneasily in his saddle, as though suddenly doubting whether he could back up his words. Then he glanced back at his men, either to remind himself of their support, or because he had remembered they were watching, and with that he took himself. I have no fear of your dark friend Ways, Witch. Answer me or answer the questioners. He did not sound as forceful as he had. Varen opened her mouth as if for idle conversation, but before she could speak, Elaine jumped in, voice ringing with command. I am Elaine, daughter heir of Andor. If you do not move aside at once, you will have Queen Morghese to answer to, White Cloak. Varen hissed with vexation. The White Cloak looked taken aback for an instant, but then he laughed. You think it so, yes? Perhaps you will discover Morghese no longer has so much love for Witch's Girl. If I take you from them and return you to her side, she will thank me for it. Lord Captain Aemon Valda would like very much to speak to you, daughter heir of Andor. He raised a hand. Whether to gesture or signal his men, Egwene could not say. Some of the White Cloaks gathered their reins. There's no more time to wait, Egwene thought. I will not be chained again. She opened herself to the one power. It was a simple exercise, and after long practice it went much more swiftly than the first time she had tried. In a heartbeat, her mind emptied of everything but a single rosebud floating in emptiness. She was the rosebud, opening to the light, opening to saidar, the female half of the true source. The power flooded her, threatening to sweep her away. It was like being filled with the light, like being one with the light, a glorious ecstasy. She fought to keep from being overwhelmed and focused on the ground in front of the White Cloak officer's horse, a small patch of ground. She did not want to kill anyone. You will not take me. The man's hand was still going up. With a roar, the ground in front of him erupted in a narrow fountain of dirt and rocks higher than his head. Screaming, his horse reared, and he rolled out of his saddle like a sack. Before he hit the ground, Egwene shifted her focus closer to the other White Cloaks, and the ground threw up another small explosion. Bella danced sideways, but she controlled the mare with reins and knees without even thinking of it. Wrapped inside emptiness, she was still surprised at a third eruption.
Oh yeah, Panic Cat. How you doing?
Distantly, she was aware of Nynaeve and Elaine,
How's that bowl?
both enveloped in the glow that said they too had embraced saidar, had been embraced by it. That aura would not be visible to any but another woman who could channel, but the results were visible to all. Explosions harried the White Cloaks on every side, showering them with dirt, shaking them with noise, sending their horses plunging wildly. Huron stared around him, mouth open and obviously as frightened as the White Cloaks, as he tried to keep the litter horses and his own mount from bolting. Varen was wide-eyed with astonishment and anger. Her mouth worked furiously, but whatever she might be saying was lost in the thunder. And then the White Cloaks were running away, some dropping their bows in panic, galloping as if the Dark One himself were at their backs. All but the young officer, who was picking himself up off the ground. Shoulders hunched, he stared at Varen,
Oh
the
yeah.
whites of his eyes showing all the way round. Dust stained his fine white cloak and his face, but he did not seem to notice. Kill me then, witch, he said shakily. Go ahead, kill me as you killed my father. The Aes Sedai ignored him. Her attention was all on her companions. As if they too had forgotten their officer, the fleeing White Cloaks vanished over the same rise where they had first appeared, all in a body and none looking back. The officer's horse ran with them. Under Varen's furious gaze, Egwene let go of saidar slowly, unwillingly. It was was always hard letting go. Even more slowly, the glow around Nynaeve vanished. Nynaeve stared hard at the pinch-faced white cloak before them, as if he might still be capable of some sort of trickery. Elaine looked shocked by what she had done. "What you have done," Varen began, then stopped to take a deep breath. Her stare took in all three of the younger women. "What you have done is an abomination. An abomination! An Aes Sedai does not use the power as a weapon except against Shadow Spawn, or in the last extreme to defend her life. The three oaths, they were ready to kill us," Nynaeve broke in heatedly. "Kill us or carry us off to be tortured." He was
Hey,
even-
Phil House, how you doing?
It was not really using
Thanks
the
for
power
stopping
as a
by.
weapon, Varen Sedai. Elaine held her chin high, but her voice shook. "We did not hurt anyone, or even try to hurt anyone. Surely do not split hairs with me," Varen snapped. "When you become full Aes Sedai, if you ever become full Aes Sedai, you will be bound to obey the three oaths. But even novices are expected to do their best to live as if already bound." "What about him?" Nynaeve gestured to the white cloak officer, still standing there and looking stunned. Her face was as tight as a drum. She seemed almost as angry as the Aes Sedai. "He was about to take us prisoner. Matt will die if he doesn't reach the tower soon, and Egwene knew what Nynaeve was struggling not to say aloud. "And we can't let that sack fall into any hands but the Amerlins." Varen regarded the white cloak wearily. "He was only trying to bully us, child. He knew very well he could not make us go where we did not want, not without more trouble than he was willing to accept. Not here, not in sight of Tar Valon. I could have talked us past him, with a little time and a little patience. Oh, he might well have tried to kill us if he could have done it from hiding, but no white cloak with the brains of a goat will try harming an Aes Sedai who knows he's there. See what you have done. What stories will those men tell, and what harm will it do?" The officer's face had reddened when she mentioned hiding. "It is no cowardice not to charge the powers that broke the world," he burst out. "You witches want to break the world again in the service of the Dark One." Varen shook her head in tired disbelief. Egwene wished she could mend some of the damage she had done. "I'm very sorry for what I did," she told the officer. She was glad she was not bound to speak no word that was not true, as full Aes Sedai were, because what she had said was only half true at best. "I should not have, and I apologize. I'm sure Varen Sedai will heal your bruises." He stepped back as if she had offered to have him skinned alive, and Varen sniffed loudly. "We have come a long way," Egwene went on. "All the way from Tomon Head, and if I weren't so tired, I would never have—" "Be quiet, girl!" Varen shouted. At the same time, the white cloak snarled, "Tomon Head? Falme? You were at Falme?" He stumbled back another step and half drew his sword. From the look on his face, Egwene did not know whether he meant to attack or to defend himself. Huron moved his horse closer to the white cloak, a hand on his sword breaker, but the narrow-faced man went on in a rant, spittle flying with his fury. "My father died at Falme. Bayar told me you witches killed him for your false dragon. I'll see you dead for it. I will see you burned." "Impetuous children," Varen sighed. "Almost as bad as boys for letting your mouths run away with you." "Go with the light, my son," she told the white cloak. Without another word, she guided them around the man, but his shouts followed after. "My name is Dane Bornhold. Remember it, dark friends. I will make you fear my name. Remember my name." As Bornhold's shouts faded behind them, they rode in silence for a time. Finally, Egwene said to no one in particular, "I was only trying to make things better." "Better," Varen muttered. "You must learn there is a time to speak all of the truth and a time to govern your tongue. The least of the lessons you must learn, but important if you need to live long enough to wear the shawl of a full sister. Did it never occur to you that word of Falme might have come ahead of us?" "Why should it have occurred to her?" Nynaeve asked. "No one we've met before this had heard more than run even more in the last month. And all word has to come along the same roads we used, Varen replied. We have moved slowly. Romer takes wing along 100 paths. Always plan for the worst, child. That way all your surprises will be pleasant ones. What did he mean about my mother? Elaine said suddenly. He must have been lying. She would never turn against Tar Valon. The queens of Andor have always been friends to Tar Valon, but all things change. Varen's face was calm again, yet there was a tightness in her voice. She turned in her saddle to look over them, the three young women, Hurin, Mat, and the litter. The world is strange, and all things change. They capped the ridge. A village was in sight ahead of them now. Yellow tile roofs clustered around the great bridge that led to Tar Valon. Now you must truly be on your guard, Varen told them. Now the real danger begins. Chapter 11. Tar Valon. The small village of Darien had lain beside the river Aranon almost as long as Tar Valon had occupied its island. Darien's small red and brown brick houses and shops, its stone-paved streets, gave a feel of permanence, but the village...
All right, everyone, I'm gonna call it into this live for right now. Thanks everyone for stopping by. Everyone who keeps stopping by. I definitely appreciate the love and support everyone shows me. Hey, Manic Mouse. How you doing?
Ensured it would always be rebuilt, however many times it was destroyed, so long as Tar Valon stood at least. At first it
I'll
seemed
probably
like
get
Wayne
on
was expecting war again. A
again
square
soon.
of men marched along the
If not on some
streets, ranks of
gameplay, then
files
another
with
live like
popping
this.
cone, followed by bowmen in flat-rimmed helmets.
But until next time, everyone, Hobo Scum out.